All right, thank you, team. We move on to our next talk. How about a big round of applause for the incredible Huseyin Sami? Beautiful. In an exhibition which is about painting, but above all about the love of the material of paint, these works really kind of stand out as the most kind of direct response to that material. I'm really glad that you're here because we did the tour with the guides and the volunteers, and a lot of them refused to believe that these were paint. They said, "Oh no, it's plastic," and blah 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 blah. Yeah. So let's just clear that up right away. What are these beautiful works made of? They're saying
plastic. No. Well, essentially, the material. I mean, it's household paint, but household paint is engineered now, so it's a plastic. So. But it's household paint, essentially. So, it's a material that has that longevity. It's been engineered to kind of withstand the Australian sun and all the weather. But for me, it's been a material I've been using for 20 plus years. Since art school, and just been kind of obsessed with understanding the material, sort of really intimately. Making a lot of mistakes with it, just through the process of making works, and I think that's the kind of the joy I've had and the interest I've kind of sustained with the material is sort of working through in the sort of process of making works for 20 odd years now. So.
And so let's cast your mind back to art school 20 years ago. Was it SEA? SEA, Sydney College of Arts of Sydney Uni. Yep. So can you talk us through the moment where you sort of discovered this material and first sort of had the impetus to start working with it?
Yeah, probably after first year. So first year, we sort of all had to use oils, work in a certain way, sort of go through, exercises and studies and things like that to understand the basics, the techniques, the convention, the paradigm of painting, essentially. So I think first year, working with oils, it was probably the first time I actually worked with oils, to be honest. Didn't really love it, didn't love the smell, found it really, difficult to work with. That's kind of my first interaction with it. I didn't enjoy it as much. Although I was quite proficient with it, sort of portraiture or still life, it didn't really catch my attention in terms of like something I wanted to sustain or sort of keep doing. And then second year was more experimental. You get through first year and you kind of start to formulate ideas and think about what it is that you really want to be doing. Although, like Jasper says, like when you're at art school, it's like you don't know what you want to do. It's like you're sort of finding yourself and finding forms, subject matter. But for me, it was sort of like I kind of embedded myself in the library. It was just learning the history, and that's all I consumed for a good chunk of that year. Just understanding what had come before. So the history of art making, what had come beforehand. So to kind of understand where I wanted to put myself or where I wanted to place myself within that historical context, within painting in particular, and then sort of look at what it is I wanted to make. But then sort of started working with materials that weren't sort of conventional, so household paint. Really, I mean, for me, the idea of pouring just came a lot from, again, kind of looking at, in a historical context, looking at Pollock, looking at artists like Linda Benglis, Morris Lewis, people like that. And so I just started pouring over everything in the studio. So I'd set up things, dragging tables, dragging chairs, on canvas, whatever I could do, to kind of utilise this material in an unconventional way, or for me, a seemingly unconventional way within the studio context anyway. But that's essentially kind of when it started, was second year.
Second year, yeah.
And then just sort of working out, how to mess things up, sort of to kind of rebuild it again.
And it's not, further to sort of what we were saying before, it's not like in second year of art school you mastered that technique and then just continued to do it for 20 years.
No.
In some ways you would feel that you're still playing.
I'm still learning, absolutely, yeah. I think it's, I mean, you get to a certain point where you understand the material in how it's going to behave, and that's through, sort of constant use of it in the process that you engage with in making. But there's still a lot of things that go wrong, and still till this day, I have problems with certain paints and the weather. It's very important that the climate that I work in, to be able to make certain works, it's sort of, I have to have certain optimal conditions to be able to dry paint properly. I mean, if it doesn't dry properly, the oils or the chemical within the paint doesn't allow it to kind of work the way I want it. I like the idea of things going wrong, because I think a lot comes out of mistakes, and I've had a lot of works that have sprung, ideas for works that have sprung out of issues in the studio, or making works that then become, problematic, but something else comes out of it. And I think that idea of constantly working and engaging in a practice, making work continually, for me, it's always sort of been a habit that I've sort of, harnessed and sort of become, my everyday. So sort of I'm still discovering things in terms of, the next painting I want to make, or, the next series of works that I like to explore. But I think it's more about, how to continue that painting practice. For me, it's kind of why I kind of engage in what I do. Yeah.
And art school is such a magical time. Like, everyone I know, they sort of like look back on it and go, wow, like, what an amazing time. And what makes it, I think, amazing in some ways is the kind of restraint, like often kind of financial kind of constraints that, they're young students, right? So they don't have all the money in the world to get all the fanciest kind of stuff. They sort of have to work with what they can find. And, a lot of artists talk about, if you go to Bunnings, if anyone goes to any Bunnings right now, there's a box in the paint section, which is called mistints, right? And they're things that they've screwed up, like where they haven't got the right kind of thing. So rather than discarding it, they put it there. And all the young painters that I know who went to like art school and stuff, that they would feverishly kind of mine these to try and look for colours, because it was cheap, it's discounted kind of paint. And I remember talking to this one artist about finding this mistint colour, when he was at art school at the Bunnings in Alexandria. And it's this really specific colour, and then spending like the rest of his career just trying to make this colour. So there's something about once again about the era. This is an industrial era by the people at Bunnings, but it creates something kind of unique. Was that a factor in as well to working with the sort of egalitarian material of like house paint? And
I mean, I think like you said, being at art school, you don't have a lot of money. So you go to the hardware store, and I was kind of mining that, a lot of different stores for mistints. So, I mean, colour wasn't really a big consideration for me. It was just more dealing with the material and working with it in a specific way. So, you'd work with sort of really, horrendous colours, sort of like the Mission Browns, or these sort of like horrible greens, and, mixed with whites and stuff like that. So, it was more about the material and how that sort of, when it dried and sort of the malleable form, so sort of would then become, subject to, making objects out of it, or utilising it within the painting, creating structures in order to pour the paint through. So just really experimenting a lot with the idea, the practice that I kind of like myself as a mediator between the material and the surface, so how that sort of then generated works for me. But yeah, mistints for me was just like, well, let's go, like $10, yeah, bang, I'll take the lot, for $100, so because I'd go through so much paint, you can imagine just sort of pouring copious amounts of paint and not really, I mean, just sort of having that thirst and just wanting to get things get through some work, and needing that material to do that. So you just sort of like, yeah.
And I love that interplay between the sort of practical and the sort of the chance, but also to the sort of writing and the theory. Huseyin has an incredible publication that was sort of released last year called Painting.
That's great.
Yeah, and this obsession, and it is really like a lot of the images of his beautiful work, but also to writing about it and the kind of the thinking about it. So I guess for an outsider or someone who's not an artist or whatever, and we will talk about colour in a second, because I think although back then colour wasn't important to you, I think it's profoundly important now. So when you approach these kind of works and making these pours with the polymer paint and things like that, I guess one question might be, how do you know it's good, or how do you know that it's right, or what about it speaks to you where you go, yeah, that's working.
Yeah. Oh, look, such a tough question. I think it's because I don't really understand what it's going to look like, or I know how it's going to start, but I don't know how it's going to finish. So I don't really have an idea about.
We might speak up a little bit because it's quite noisy in the cafe. Yeah.
So I don't really understand what the finished work will look like, essentially. So it's hard to gauge. It's sort of in the act of making them, I kind of get to a certain point where I think it's more instinctual, where I think, okay, I'm kind of happy with where it's at. Sometimes I like to push it a little bit further, where I'm not comfortable. I kind of don't like that comfort zone for myself. I like kind of not really. It may sound a little silly, but when I feel like I'm in an uncomfortable position with a work where I'm looking at it or anything that I'm making, I think I know I'm on the right track.
Yeah.
Whereas when I'm more comfortable with the work, or I feel sort of satisfied in a certain way, aesthetically, I kind of like don't like that feeling so much.
Yeah. You don't trust it.
I don't trust it.
Yeah.
So I want to kind of like mess it up a bit more, or kind of push it a little bit. I like pushing the boundary of the work, and even though they may look aesthetically, sort of like, chromatically satisfying for the viewer, but for me, I mean, it's a seductive material. I can't get away from that. I'm not trying to get away from that. I think it's sort of just, it's inherent in the work and inherent in the material. So for me, it's more about the engagement of the process of making the works, and because this is only sort of one suite or avenue that I pursue with the material itself. There's still the performative aspects, there's the sculptural aspects and object making that still utilise paint as the basis. So I've kind of got that core foundation of the material, which then kind of spawns all of these other avenues of work.
It's important to note that Huseyin, has a multidisciplinary practice across, lots of different things, as into performance, into writing, even this act of sort of talking about stuff, but back to that essential thing of the painting. So let's talk briefly about colour, because I really do feel it is something that has come into your work. It's fundamental, but you also too sort of you have a kind of palette as well too, that that reappears throughout works through that period. What is it about these colours that sort of speak to you?
I think again it's more coming back to the hardware store. So you kind of have that ready-made palette that you can select from, and I kind of refer to it as a domestic palette, because people use these colour pickers for selecting colours they're going to paint their interiors or exteriors with. So they're quite, a lot of the time they're pastels, and like you said, the mist tints then sort of started becoming a driver of the colour palette as well, because a lot of people would disregard a colour because the shade, that white was slightly darker or what have you, so they wouldn't want to use it. So I kind of had these, colours available to me to use, and then started to formulate over time like that. And then it just, for me, it started to become quite specific. Okay, well, I'm going to start to select a certain section of this colour chart, and I'm going to work with that quite uniquely, and very, very rarely I'll kind of like high key type colours won't enter the palette. You know, black is probably on the other side of the spectrum, and then sort of white is on the other side. So, and in between, it's a mixture of the palette that you see in these paintings, essentially. So, it hasn't, and it's just more, you know, the availability of the colours as well.
Yeah.
So I'm not using traditional acrylics where you kind of have
a huge spectrum,
such a spectrum of colour. So for me, it's, you know, working within the colour palette that the hardware store affords me.
Yeah.
And then, I'm thinking now, look, I used to be quite hard on myself in terms of the selection. It's like, well, why are you being so hard on yourself?
Yeah.
You've earned that right to maybe start to be a little bit more selective about what colours you want to use, and work that way. So, yeah.
And maybe I'll end on sort of a similar question that I asked Jasper, which is about, you know, you're a family man, you've got a life and stuff like that. But, you know, how fundamental to your kind of life, your daily life, is this kind of process of going into the studio and making these works? Yeah.
I mean, it's really, for me, it's the core of who I am and what I do. And I just sort of finished renovating the studio for the past 6 months, so I hadn't had a space. And like Jasper said, like, you know, you couldn't go mental. Yeah. Because you need that output, and for me, it's kind of like a daily ritual, you know, to be working, making something or thinking about something. You know, it just needs to be within a studio environment. And I think I kind of learned that early on at art school, and having that mentorship with a lot of great artists that were there, but particularly with John Nixon, who I, you know, was a studio hand for a little period, but kind of learning from him that, you know, to be an artist, you really need to be in the studio every day from 7 to 5, you know, and treat it like a job, because it is your job. Yeah. But having that kind of mentality, of that kind of working mentality, I think, you know, it makes you go into that studio thinking about, okay, what's the next work, or what am I working on now, or finishing off something. But there's that constant, you know, working through of ideas. That's really important. It's engaging to your practice. It's very, very critical. And that motif, kind of like what Jasper was saying before about like a house painter or you know, it's an industrial task. Absolutely. Yeah. So it's very it's very critical, I think, you know, for any artist practicing today. I think for me, it's been, you know, something that completely fundamental. Yeah. Team, the incredible Huseyin Sami. Thank you.